Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Ream Library. My name is Brent Otto, and I'm Global Catholicism Fellow in the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at Holy Cross. The McFarland Center sponsors an array of campus lectures, discussions, conferences, symposia, and conversations which foster dialogue or on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation, as well as initiatives to foster Jewish-Christian understanding and to enhance our understanding of Catholicism from a global perspective. This afternoon, we are very pleased to welcome Manisha Sinha, whose talk this evening is entitled The Fall of the Second American Republic. Professor Sinha is one of the most distinguished historians of slavery, abolition, and the Civil War era. She holds the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, and is the author of several groundbreaking works, including The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, which redefined the history of anti-slavery and was awarded the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. Her research has profoundly shaped how we understand Reconstruction, African American political activism, and the broader struggle for democracy in the United States. Manisha is no stranger to Holy Cross. She has been a generous mentor to Professor C.J. Martin, who teaches in Montserrat, a grad school classmate of history professor Michael West, and is the wife of our philosophy professor, Karsten Stuber. Her lecture today examines the long unwinding of what she calls the Second American Republic, that constitutional order forged in the wake of the Civil War and Reconstruction. As she will argue, the retreat from Reconstruction's promises not only re-entrenched white supremacy in the South, but also laid the foundation for American imperial expansion in the West, in the Caribbean, and in the Pacific. This talk invites us to rethink the connections between domestic struggles over democracy and racial justice and the emergence of the United States as a global imperial power. Professor Sinha's scholarship is deeply engaged with contemporary debates about democracy, citizenship, history, historical memory, making her insights especially urgent in our current political moment. So we are very privileged to have her with us today, and I'm very delighted to welcome her to this podium. Please join me in greeting her.
Thank you, Brent, for that introduction, and it does feel a little bit like coming home at Holy Cross because of so many connections, old connections and new. So I'm really delighted to be here, though competing with this fabulous weather outside, right, at the end of the semester rush, I imagine. But thank you all for coming today. My talk today will be derived from my book on Reconstruction, but it'll focus more on the latter half of the book that talks about the fall of Reconstruction. So the crucial question of Reconstruction, of course, is this: how did interracial democracy progress under the revolutionary impetus of the Civil War and emancipation, and why did that effort unravel by the end of the 19th century? Reconstruction, of course, is the period immediately after the Civil War, or at least traditionally it is seen as that. Reconstruction birthed a national citizenship, expanding the boundaries of political belonging, rights, and claims on the nation state, building, quote, a composite nation. As the self-emancipated abolitionists Frederick Douglass argued, was the greatest challenge of what I call the Second American Republic. It was a fraught and contested project. Nearly 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War, and nearly 100,000 indigenous people were killed in wars, in reservations, and in assimilation campaigns during the second half of the 19th century. Around 4 million enslaved won their freedom and citizenship rights, only to be subject to a new regime of racist terror after the destruction of Reconstruction. Despite the emergence of the suffrage movement, women remained disfranchised. Asian immigrants were systematically excluded, and strikes by workers of all ethnicities violently put down. So within this larger frame, my book focuses on the debate over who is a citizen and the role of the state in expanding or constricting rights and indigenous sovereignty. Its primary theme is the ongoing tension between democracy and capitalism, with the latter's historical entanglement in slavery and imperialism. Now, after the industrial takeoff in the United States, this is immediately after the overthrow of Reconstruction, the reconstruction of capitalism proved to be successful, even as the reconstruction of democracy faltered. Democracy in the United States has always been rigorously challenged by forces of political and economic reaction. The rapid industrialization of the country and the dismal conditions of labor, this is free labor in the North, that followed Reconstruction, made a mockery of the free labor ideology of the victorious North. New wars and imperial dreams of empire inspired by the regime of racist apartheid in the post-war South and the conquest of Western Indian nations further hobbled American democracy at home and abroad. By the end of the 19th century, a formal US empire would subject people from the Caribbean to the Philippines to colonial rule. The demise of the Second American Republic inaugurated an era of hierarchy and inequality, racial, ethnic, gendered, and economic, rather than the one of equal citizenship promised by the War for Emancipation and Reconstruction. So connecting the struggle for Black citizenship during Reconstruction with debates over ethnicity, gender, economic autonomy, and sovereignty that ranged at the same time, I aim to show that we have missed much by confining our vision of the end of Reconstruction to the South. So here I will briefly tell you a little bit about Reconstruction, or what I call abolition democracy, if you're not familiar with this period. It's such a brief period in US history that most historians or even casual students of American history do not understand its significance. I argue that Reconstruction began with the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency and unwound only by the end of the 19th century. But these are the achievements of Reconstruction. Of course, beginning with the Emancipation Proclamation, but also the Reconstruction constitutional amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment that established national citizenship. There was no national standard for citizenship before Reconstruction, a binaturalization or birthright. And you know that this is quite a controversial question now, national birthright, citizenship, and of course the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote, so not to women. It also expanded the federal government considerably, both during the Civil War and Reconstruction. You have the creation of the first federal government agency, the Freedmen's Bureau, that was overseeing the transition from slavery to freedom. You have the first federal civil rights acts. So these are significant achievements in Reconstruction. You had the Enforcement Acts that again expanded the powers of the federal government to combat racist terror in the South, especially by the first Ku Klux Klan and other racist domestic terrorist groups like the White Leagues, the White Liners, the Red Shirts. There were a whole variety of them. And I argue that the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution that gave women the right to vote should also be seen as a Reconstruction amendment. Not only did the suffrage movement take off during Reconstruction, but the 19th Amendment, its wordings replicated very closely the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. Except the 15th Amendment uses, race or color or previous condition of servitude, referring to freed people in the South. The 19th Amendment, of course, says you cannot discriminate when it comes to suffrage on the basis of sex. So these are the considerable achievements of Reconstruction, or what I call abolition democracy, but I'm not going to be talking about it much today. Today I'm going to talk more about the unwinding of Reconstruction from around 1877 right up to the end of the 19th century. And this is something that most historians of Reconstruction don't do. They just end at 1877. They don't talk about that long unwinding of Reconstruction. So it is not only the chronology and scope of my new book, but its interpretation that is at odds with conventional narratives, which have emphasized how the United States was able to develop a unique and long-lasting experiment in Republican government by expanding democracy incrementally but consistently to groups previously denied inclusion. In the prevailing view, the Anglo-American tradition of liberal democracy is distinct from the more volatile histories of continental Europe, or so the story goes. From simplistic stories of American exceptionalism to more sophisticated analyses of democracy in the Western world, the old consensus cannot in fact explain the violent upheavals of the mid to late 19th century in the United States, the Civil War itself, and of course, the brutal and violent overthrow of Reconstruction in the South. As President Abraham Lincoln put it in December 1862, and this is one of my favorite quotes as a historian, quote, "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history." The Civil War resulted in what I call the destruction of the First Republic and birthed the Second. My notion of a Second Republic comes from the history of French republicanism. Now, of course, it's not a perfect match. The French have had 5 republics and 5 constitutions, while the United States has periodically remade its democracy through constitutional amendments and federal laws. So in borrowing that terminology of the First and Second Republic to describe events in the United States, I seek to highlight the growth of reactionary authoritarianism in the post-war South, a type of politics that we often associate with Europe or the rest of the Americas, where republics came and went. Put simply, the long afterlives of slavery and imperialism are as important to understanding US history as our more familiar ameliorative tales about the abolition of slavery and the expansion of democracy and citizenship during Reconstruction. The story of the contest between the two is designed to capture an essential and ongoing theme in the United States, which was never all one or the other. Not only that, but the history of the unmaking of Reconstruction reveals the global significance of the first abortive experiment to transform the slaveholders' republic into an interracial democracy. So my goal is to put Reconstruction in this broad international context and to thereby demonstrate that its long death has as much to tell us as its short-lived triumph. Now, Americans took pride in what they saw as the differences between their republic and the old world monarchies of Europe. As Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense in 1776, quote, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." And of course, Paine was also an abolitionist. He demanded the complete abolition of slavery in the 18th century. Paine and other radicals had high hopes that the new nation would be a beacon of democratic republicanism, a secular version of John Winthrop's much maligned City on a Hill. Yet the first American republic grew into an empire for slavery, and its, quote, "manifest destiny to overspread the continent required the destruction of native nations and war against Mexico, both of which were rooted in an expansionist imperialism." Now, the Second American Republic, born during the Civil War, was thus a massive course correction, resulting in the destruction of racial slavery and the enactment of national citizenship regardless of color, race, and previous condition of servitude. Its fall rather than success paved the way for the triumph of a global US empire and revived the specifically Southern dream of an imperium built on and intended to perpetuate racial subordination. Now, a racist thermidor resulted from the unwinding of Reconstruction, which involved not just the destruction of African Americans' freedom, or I shouldn't say destruction, subjugation of African Americans and Western Indian nations, but also the exclusion of Asian and other non-white immigrants. The rise of Jim Crow in the South and other internal regimes of racist hierarchy fed into the logic and momentum of US imperialism. These domestic developments were in fact the precondition for the rise of a formal American empire. So the 1890s proved to be a crucial decade when all these events played out and when the Second American Republic finally crumbled with the establishment of US hegemony in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And this is where I guess my book is very different from books on Reconstruction, because I pay attention to the period after 1877. A lot of historians now question whether there was even a compromise or a corrupt bargain of 1877 that put the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes into the presidency and resulted in the fall of the last Reconstruction governments in the South. And so if we look at all that happens after the fall of these Reconstruction state governments in the South, which were interracial governments, you had a lot of black congressmen, state and local officials, actually thousands in the late 19th century. And those numbers would not be replicated until after the civil rights movement in the late 20th century. So once those interracial state governments fell in the South and the North and the federal government abandoned the freed people to the tender mercies of sore losers, which were of course former Confederates, who began this regime of Jim Crow segregation and disfranchisement, this had a national effect. You can see it in immigration laws, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then resulting in a very restrictive Immigration Act in 1924 that was eventually overturned after the Civil Rights Movement. You also see it in the extinguishment of native sovereignty in the West. This is when they say the frontier closed, because the US became a continental empire. With the Wounded Knee Massacre of the Lakota Indians. They were, of course, the largest largest nation in the West. And then, of course, the formal rise of segregation with Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court also plays a sorry role in implementing this. And then this formal rise of empire. 1898, the Spanish-Cuban-American War. Same year, you have the Wilmington Massacre in North Carolina, the last new interracial governments in the Upper South fall. These were alliances between black Republicans and white populist farmers. And this picture here is actually of the Wilmington Light Infantry that perpetrated this massacre. And what's interesting about, and basically had a coup. They overthrew the Republican city government of Wilmington, North Carolina. And what's interesting about these guys is that they had just fought in the Spanish-Cuban-American War. So you can see the links between imperialism and, of course, the overthrow of any semblance of interracial democracy in the South. So by not looking at the 1880s and 1890s, I feel that historians of Reconstruction have missed out on a lot. And I'll talk more about Hawaii and the pacification of the Philippines as we go along. So before the Civil War, pro-slavery imperialism had played no small part in the emergence of an anti-slavery, free soil Republican Party. And for those of you who are very confused right now, everything you know about the Democrat and Republican Party today, you simply need to switch it for the 19th century. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, anti-slavery, black rights during Reconstruction, and big government. They expanded the federal government enormously. The Democratic Party was the party of slavery, of segregation, of Southern Dixiecrats, and of states' rights. They did not want a big federal government intervening in their, quote, home affairs. So in addition to the continental expansion and the annexation of Mexican territory, and I should tell you that Lincoln began his national career as an anti-war politician. He opposed the Mexican War as a land grab for slavery. So the Franklin Pierce administration, which was a Democratic administration, unilaterally acquired the so-called Guano Islands in the Pacific, prized for their valuable guano fertilizer. Pro-slavery imperialists and northern capitalists hoped to make a windfall from guano. Their recipe for capitalist imperialism, sponsorship of corporate interests by government, despite a commitment to laissez-faire when it came to economic regulation and the interests of labor. This is classical liberalism, that government should not intervene in the economy and society, what we call political conservatism today. So they had that formal commitment to that, but they were actually using the powers of government to further their economic interests. So this recipe for capitalist imperialism was born in the hunt for guano. And they also used contract and semi-free servile labor, not enslaved labor, but servile labor, usually non-white labor. So that was the recipe that was successful in guano. In 1867, the United States formally annexed 2 of the Guano Islands, as well as the Midway Islands, and bought Alaska from the Russian Empire, the last deemed Seward's folly after the Secretary of State William H. Seward, because it was viewed as a barren, cold piece of worthless land. Seward valued Alaska for its strategic location, and of course, Alaskans, indigenous people like the Tlingits, were not consulted in this imperial transaction between the US and Russia. He also viewed the Aleutian Islands as, quote, the drawbridge to Asia, island stepping stones across the Pacific. This idea of islands linking the United States to Asia was why Midway, Hawaii, and eventually Guam were valued as coaling stations to enable Navy and commercial ships to operate far from North America. Seward's support for Andrew Johnson, who was the Southern president who succeeded Lincoln by accident of history. Lincoln is assassinated, and he opposed Reconstruction. And Seward, who was formerly associated with the more liberal wing of the Republican Party, completely allies with Johnson. And this aligned also with his imperialism. And he, with pro-slavery Democratic administrations, before the war even had sponsored the acquisition of the Guano Islands. Democratic expansionist Robert J. Walker of Mississippi, like Seward, dreamed of US hegemony in Panama, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Many Deep South slaveholders had long envisioned slavery's empire extending from Texas to California, from Nicaragua to Cuba. This is what the historian Gerald Horne has called the White Pacific. The emergence of an overseas American empire, though, was not inevitable. The abolition of slavery and the defeat of the misbegotten Confederacy reverberated throughout the Western Hemisphere. In 1861, the Mexican Republic was overthrown by the French, who installed the brother of the Austrian Emperor, Maximilian I, as the Emperor of Mexico in 1863. The same year, Spain annexed the Dominican Republic, and later on, Grant even had some plans to annex the Dominican Republic, but abolitionists and radical Republicans opposed this plan, and that plan was defeated. With American moral support, Mexicans defeated and executed France's puppet leader in 1866. This is why we celebrate Cinco de Mayo, the 5th of May. Benito Juarez, who had been ousted by the French, was reinstated as president. In 1862, Lincoln hailed the end of the Civil War in Argentina and a final end to slavery there. Lincoln's policy towards Latin American countries was a repudiation of the pro-slavery and democratic expansionism of his chief political rival, Stephen A. Douglas. And this is not a surprise, as I told you, he had opposed the Mexican War. By the end of the Civil War, republicanism seemed ascendant in the Americas, and anti-slavery appeared to be prevailing across the globe. The Dutch also inaugurated a program of gradual emancipation in 1863, when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. As Charles Sumner, the radical Republican senator from Massachusetts, predicted during Reconstruction, quote, slavery will end very soon in Cuba. It cannot remain much longer in Brazil. These were the only large slave societies left in the 19th century, the United States South, Cuba, and Brazil, because colonial slavery had been abolished in the northern states during the era of the American Revolution, and the British had abolished slavery in the Caribbean. In their colonies, you had the Haitian Revolution, which is the instance of a first successful slave revolt in world history. So slavery was on the wane, except in these areas, the US South, Cuba, and Brazil. And the American Civil War rang its death knell. Anti-slavery republicanism spread to Cuba during the 10 Years' War for its independence from Spain, with Afro-Cuban generals and soldiers making emancipation a complementary goal. And you see a picture here of General Antonio Maceo Grajales. What's interesting about this Afro-Cuban general is that many freed people in the South named their children Maceo after him. Of course, Brazil also had its Triple Alliance War at this time that also weakened slavery considerably there. The Spanish Cortes, or Parliament, and the Brazilian government passed free womb laws which freed children of enslaved, the way the northern states had done, nearly a century ago in 1870, 1871, respectively. And the first tentative steps towards emancipation took place in these areas, mainly to forestall a rebellion of the enslaved. In these remaining slave societies, enslaved people had revolted unsuccessfully in the 1860s, confident that Lincoln was their ally and inspired by the Union's war against the Confederacy and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. In 1873, the Spanish Cortes enacted an abolition law for Puerto Rico. So the largest slave societies in the hemisphere after the American South, Cuba and Brazil, abolished slavery by decree rather than revolution in 1886 in Cuba after the reimposition of Spanish rule, and in 1888 in Brazil. In both countries, enslaved people used a variety of means to gain their freedom, as they had done in the United States: self-purchase, military service, fugitivity, outright rebellion, and participation in abolition movements. Yet freed people in post-slavery Cuba, Brazil, and Puerto Rico, as in the post-war American South, soon found their dearly won freedom constrained by the political economy of plantation agriculture, which was tied to a global market, and by a lack of civic equality and economic autonomy. Southern Confederates who had fled to Brazil and American corporations and imperialists in Cuba warned of the disruptions to the plantation economy and the perils of interracial democracy that they had witnessed during Reconstruction. Capital's revived alliance with provincial, reactionary, planter merchant elites throughout the Americas signified the lost promise of emancipation. Wary of the revolutionary precedent of Reconstruction, local elites defeated freed people's access to the ballot and demands for land. The proven recipe, the Mississippi Plan of 1890, which formally disfranchised all African American men and then became a model for all the other southern states, was first implemented in Brazil in 1881 when the conservative pro-slavery government disfranchised the majority of its population, including nearly all former slaves. As in the United States, the emancipatory promise of abolition and democratic reform lay defeated with the reimposition of plantation economies and the reconstruction of capitalism. So these economies were revived. They quickly rejoined the world market, but it was based on the old formula of servile labor and producing cash crops to sell in the world market. So the dismantling of black citizenship became the norm in post-slavery societies in the Americas. So the international significance of the fall of the Second Republic was evident in the lessons that Western imperialists drew from the supposed impossibility of interracial democracy and black citizenship, about the necessity of ordering, quote, the relations between ruling and subject races, and the notion of, quote, the unfitness of non-white races for political rights. Pronouncing Reconstruction in the South a failure and the conquest of the West a success, the United States joined European nations in the scramble for empire. Most Americans, the historian Nina Silber observes, and I was quoting her earlier too, quote, internationalize the race problem, identifying the common backward characteristics of all non-white peoples, as well as a common superiority of Anglo-Saxons around the world. Indeed, the alleged failure of Reconstruction became the specific grounds on which American intellectuals and politicians justified not only despotic rule in the South, but an overseas empire, Jim Crow on a global scale. So John W. Burgess, a Southerner and Columbia University political scientist, my alma mater, who vilified black citizenship as, quote, a monstrous thing, and he's pictured here on the left, commended the now imperialist Republicans for taking on the white man's burden of civilizing the world and for, quote, imposing the sovereignty of the United States upon 8 millions of Asiatics in the Philippines after the Spanish-Cuban-American War of 1898. In founding an overseas empire, the administration of William McKinley, who's again in fashion, I think, had steered the Republican Party from supposedly false notions of racial equality to an understanding of the, quote, vast differences in political capacity between the races. Now, Burgess inspired his colleague, William A. Dunning, who's pictured here on the right, who with his mostly Southern students formed the Dunning School of Reconstruction Historiography. And they wrote in complement with lost cause mythologies of the Civil War that undermined the issue of slavery and said, oh, the South just fought for its honor, for states' rights, its heritage, etc. The first professionally trained historians to write on Reconstruction, they perpetrated racist stereotypes and gave scholarly legitimacy to the Jim Crow South. Now, this is what W.E.B. Du Bois called the propaganda of history in his book, Black Reconstruction, which was published in 1935, but really became the standard interpretation that historians started accepting when it was reprinted in the 1960s during the height of the civil rights movement. And now, of course, everyone reads Du Bois, no one reads Dunning and Burgess. Similarly, Charles Francis Adams Jr. wrote about the new conception of, quote, the race problem in the United States, which was taking on, quote, less of the theoretical and humanitarian approach, and instead embracing the reigning shibboleths of the pseudoscience of race, social Darwinism. Pro-slavery Confederates had been right all along in this view. And social Darwinists, of course, believed in the survival of the fittest in the social arena. They thought empathy, humanitarianism, those were bad ideas and simply not good for virile imperialistic powers of the West. So they had a really concerted critique of the abolitionist project. Ironically, it was Republicans who finally realized slaveholders' dream of an empire in the Caribbean and Central America. Murat Halstead, the journalist known for his riveting account of the presidential party conventions that led to the election of Lincoln in 1860 and who became a liberal Republican. And liberal Republicans were a breakaway group from the Republican Party. They were these classical laissez-faire liberals who opposed Reconstruction and opposed government regulation of the economy. And eventually they would come to take over the Republican Party by the end of the 19th century, which gradually transformed from the party of Lincoln and anti-slavery to the party of imperialism and big business. So Halstead, who was a liberal, quote, liberal, don't get confused, not modern liberalism, but classical laissez-faire liberalism, which today we would call conservatism, political conservatism. So Halstead now penned cheerleading reports of American empire in the Philippines, Hawaii, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. As he wrote rhapsodically about the Spanish-Cuban-American War and the acquisition of the Philippines by the United States, quote, "The deed was done with a flash of lightning. And lo, we hold the golden key of a splendid Asiatic archipelago of 1,000 beautiful and richly endowed islands in our grip." Halstead portrayed an overseas empire both as a new step for the nation as well as the logic end of settler colonialism. Quote, "It seems to be divinely appointed that our parts of empire may with advantages to ourselves and the world at large be more comprehensive than our fathers blazed them out." He recalled the continental expansion sponsored by Jefferson, writing that, quote, "We walk in the ways of the fathers when we go conquering and to conquer along the eastward shores of Asia." So the Spanish-Cuban-American War, which resulted in the annexation of the Philippines and U.S. hegemony in the Caribbean, began, of course, with an explosion on February 15, 1898 of the USS Maine, an American battleship in Havana, Cuba, killing over 200 of its crew. You probably have read about this. Cubans had revived their independence struggle against Spain in 1895 with the Cuban nationalist Jose Marti, who was a great admirer of Lincoln, and other Afro-Cuban intellectuals when they had returned home from exile in the United States. The American press already reporting sensationally on Spanish atrocities against the Cubans, and Congress, of course, blamed the Spanish for this catastrophe, though the Spanish government disavowed any responsibility. And most historians now say that the explosion in Maine was accidental, set off by gunpowder, but it started the war. The war's primary booster was McKinley's Assistant Secretary of State, Theodore Roosevelt, who aspired to embody a cult of Anglo-Saxon and virile masculinity, personally leading the Rough Riders, the name given to the first U.S. volunteer cavalry in Cuba during the war after his, quote, "many adventures against native nations in the West." He downplayed the role of black soldiers after the fact, though they had bailed out his supposed Rough Riders. The splendid little war, as it was called, came to a speedy conclusion by the end of 1898 with a Cuban and American victory that saw ex-Confederate and ex-Union soldiers united in the romance for empire. Black soldiers left behind to occupy Cuba were called, quote, "immunes," based on the false racist notion that they were immune to tropical diseases. Now, rather than supporting Cuba Libre and independent anti-colonial republics, the United States inaugurated a policy of intervention and outright annexation in the Caribbean and the Pacific. With the Treaty of Paris signed on December 10, 1898, Spain ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States and relinquished its claims on Cuba. The Philippines emerged as a point of contention, but was eventually sold to the United States for $20 million. Native populations, Puerto Ricans, Chamorros, and Filipinos, were not consulted. Cuba was not directly annexed because of the Teller Amendment passed by Congress in 1898 after the declaration of war prohibited it. But the Platt Amendment passed in 1901, when U.S. troops eventually left Cuba, sanctioned American intervention and severely compromised Cuban sovereignty. It was the blueprint for an informal American empire. The US government justified its intervention in the affairs of other countries to protect its strategic and economic interests. Now, Cuban and Filipino independence fighters could be forgiven for initially thinking that an American republic born in an anti-colonial revolution against the British Empire would support them. The logic of imperialism, fueled by a desire to exploit the world's resources for both national glory and profits, and justified by the conviction that the world's non-white peoples were incapable of self-government dictated otherwise. Halstead reported that General Emilio Aguinaldo, who had led the Filipino revolt against the Spanish, was set on, quote, Philippine independence. But he portrayed an American protectorate over he rather championed an American protectorate over the Spanish colony. He sanguinely predicted that they would, quote, walk hand in hand with us and become the greatest of our dependencies, not states, but territories. When Aguinaldo formed an independent Republican government and a congressional vote for Philippine independence was narrowly defeated, the US-Philippine War began. Now, the brutal Indian Wars in the West served as a precedent for the horrific suppression of the Filipino Republic led by Aguinaldo. The US Army sent many veterans of those wars, including Commander General-in-Chief Nelson Miles, who also led the annexation of Puerto Rico to, quote, pacify the Philippines. General Leonard Wood, known for his diary, which was a record for the hunt for Geronimo, the Chiricahua Apache leader, for which he received a Medal of Honor, became successively the military governor of Cuba and the governor general of the Philippines. In Congress, Filipinos were likened to Indians in need of, quote, civilization and Christianization, no matter that most of them were Catholic. They had been converted already by the Spanish. The senators who had voted for the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 that dispossessed the Indian nations of the West in a massive scale and resettled them in homesteads, those same senators voted to annex the Philippines, guided by the same logic of, quote, benevolent assimilation. Filipino guerrilla fighters were referred to as the N-word, were treated like Native Americans, that is, outside the bounds of civilized warfare. War crimes on both sides abounded. The torture technique of waterboarding was born in this war, and the herding of civilians into, quote, reconcentration camps, precisely the Spanish atrocities in Cuba that Americans had condemned, was reminiscent of the reservations policy towards indigenous people. So the launching of an overseas American empire was the final act in the fall of the Second American Republic. Imperialism, its critics noted, even at that time, is the highest form of capitalism. Northeastern capitalists rushed to make a killing, first in the West and then in the newly founded overseas empires, based on the exploitation of indigenous populations. Not only did the United States subjugate the former Spanish colonies, but it also annexed the Kingdom of Hawaii to protect American business interests. US missionaries and settlers had a long history of intervening in Hawaiian affairs, forcing a constitutional monarchy and then a republic in Hawaii. European and American sugar planters had prospered there on the strength of indigenous dispossession and immigrant labor from Portugal and Asia. Now, these immigrant workers signed long-term contracts that made them locked them in a state of semi-servitude, precisely the kind that freed people in the South were made to sign after emancipation. Sugar production in Hawaii increased by 100% from 1876 to 1900. And in 1887, the planter elite forced a bayonet constitution. And these constitutions, the new laws, were appropriately called in Hawaii the Mississippi laws, because they were modeled after the state constitution of Mississippi that disfranchised Black people. Now, Queen Liliuokalani, who had tried to establish Hawaiian sovereignty, actually protested this act. As you can see, she says here, perhaps there is a kind of right, depending on the precedents of all ages, and known as, quote, the right of conquest, under which robbers and marauders establish themselves in possession of whatsoever are strong enough to ravish their fellows. So it happens that overawed by the power of the United States to the extent that they can neither themselves throw off the usurpers nor obtain assistance from other friendly states, the people of the islands have no voice in determining their future, but are virtually relegated to the condition of the Aborigines of the American continent. She's saying this after the annexation of Hawaii in 1898. She drew a straight line from indigenous dispossession in the West to American empire. The white planter oligarchy, trained, quote, in the habits of autocracy, was anything but ideal citizens of democracy. The annexationist party was dangerous to the health of the American Republic itself, she warned. Now, opposition to the annexation of overseas territories led to the formation of the Anti-Imperialist League in Boston in 1898. A conglomeration of business, labor, and political leaders, its first president was George S. Boutwell, the radical Republican who had been one of the House managers in Andrew Johnson's impeachment. Andrew Johnson was the first president of the United States to ever be impeached because of his opposition to Reconstruction and black rights. And he had also served as the Secretary of Treasury in the Grant administration after Johnson was removed, and he was not even a presidential candidate in 1868. Still a staunch defender of Reconstruction, Boutwell was joined by other anti-slavery men such as Oscar Garrison Willard, the grandson of William Lloyd Garrison, and Moorfield Story, who would become the founding president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So in addition to opposing the annexation of Hawaii, the League exposed U.S. war crimes in the Philippines. It adopted an address in 1899 that compared Aguinaldo's government and the Philippines Constitution to the Continental Congress of 1775. Attacking what it identified, quote, as a war of subjugation, the address declared, any right that we assert to ownership of the Philippines must rest, therefore, either upon conquest or purchase from their Spanish oppressors, or upon both, and in any case it is, we believe, inconsistent with the principles of this republic and fraught with danger to its peace and peace of the world. And the address decried imperialism, militarism, and colonialism, demanding that the United States recognize Filipino independence. According to Boutwell, McKinley had created, quote, subject races in violation of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in the United States and governed the new colonies as if the Constitution did not exist. He traced his own anti-imperialism to his anti-slavery beliefs. And he was saying that the United States was becoming a colonial power, no different from the old monarchies of Europe, even though America, quote, was a republic. And you can see from the literature here, they were pretty active in printing pamphlets like the old abolitionists and spreading their message. And you see this image that they circulated. This is William McKinley contemplating the Philippines to annex it. And there's Liberty, Statue of Liberty, it's sort of and Justice, removing a curtain and showing the lynching of black people that was taking place in the South in an unprecedented scale. Thousands of African Americans, men, women, and children were lynched at this time. The caption below says, civilization begins at home. So those people are also making connections between the fall of Reconstruction, the people who opposed imperialism, and the rise of U.S. empire. So by the 20th century, the United States replaced Britain as the dominant industrial, military, and political, if not territorial, imperium. The establishment of racial apartheid in the former slave states is not often seen as an integral part of the history of American imperialism. But the two processes were in fact interlinked and together reveal the world historical significance of the fall of the Second American Republic. Thank you for listening so patiently.